Tonight we journey into the dim corridors of the past, where the candles gutter, the floor creaks beneath your feet, and somewhere in the distance, a crown clinks against a skull. This isn't a tour of shining palaces or noble knights. It's the dark, twisting tunnel of the worst kings medieval history had to offer. You find yourself clutching your cloak a little tighter, because the air stinks of sweat, rot, and betrayal. The halls you walk aren't lined with glory but with gruesome decisions, crumbling dynasties, and rulers so bafflingly incompetent or vicious, you'll wonder how anyone made it out of the Middle Ages at all. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you are right now, so we can all get lost in the past together. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink as the shadows thicken, and suddenly, you're in 6th century Gaul. The Roman Empire is dead, and in its grave something raw and tribal has taken root. The Merovingian kings, who rule not with law or strategy, but with blades, wives, poison, and warlike children. You're in the court of Chilperic I, king of Neustria. He smiles at you, but you instantly wish he hadn't. His teeth are uneven. His eyes are dead. You wonder if he's going to execute you, or marry you off to someone he plans to assassinate. Maybe both. Chilperic's reign, 561 to 584, plays out like a bad Shakespearean knockoff. This is the guy historians call the Nero and Herod of his age. Not because he fiddled or built temples, but because his entire rule was defined by suspicious murders, non-stop civil wars, and a stunning inability to keep any family member alive or loyal. He marries the ambitious Fredegund, a former servant who may have poisoned her rivals, though some argue Chilperic himself handled those accidents. One of his brothers is stabbed in the back, literally, another dies mysteriously, and his sons are dying like houseflies. As you stand there, you wonder, is this court cursed, or is the king just really, really bad at keeping people alive? You try not to gag as a noblewoman collapses mid-meal, poisoned wine. No one flinches. This is normal. Fredegund just dabs the corner of her mouth with a napkin and resumes eating. Chilperic, meanwhile, is launching legal reforms no one asked for. He rewrites Frankish law to strengthen royal power, but the way he does it? Haphazard, rushed, and cruel. He tries to force a single liturgy and a revision of the alphabet. Yes, he messes with spelling. Imagine a dictator who cancels vowels. Not very popular. Now, historians still argue whether Chilperic was a misunderstood reformer or just your average blood-soaked opportunist. But as you duck beneath a flying goblet during one of his infamous palace feasts, you're not convinced there's much to redeem him. You travel south, hoping for fresh air, but instead land in the realm of Untold, a Merovingian pretender. He's backed by the Byzantines, which is ironic, because you'd expect the Eastern Empire to pick someone competent. But no, Untold lasts barely a year before being betrayed and burned alive in a church siege. Charismatic? Maybe. Strategic? Definitely not. As you stagger back into Neustria, there's a new king, Clotaire II. You want to root for him, and for a moment, things seem quieter. But then he unleashes his son Dagobert I, and the Merovingians just slide right back into infighting and religious manipulation. You're standing in a throne room again, different king, same smell. The Frankish tradition of splitting the kingdom among sons isn't working. It never worked. Each generation restarts the war from scratch, carving the realm like a stale loaf of bread. No one gets a full slice. Everyone's hungry. And just when you think things can't get more dysfunctional, you hear the clink of chains. It's Theuderic III, who will lose so many battles you wonder if he's doing it on purpose. He's a puppet king, controlled by the real power. The mayors of the palace, like Pepin of Herstal and Charles Martel, men who will eventually push the Merovingians off the stage entirely. Now here's the quirky twist. The Merovingians believed in the sacred power of their hair. Long-haired kings were seen as chosen by God. So, to disinherit a prince or humiliate a rival, you just shaved them. Yes, The most feared punishment in Merovingian politics was a bad haircut. Eventually, even that sacred hair can't save them. The dynasty crumbles into obscurity, and the Carolingians rise. You watch the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, shuffled off to a monastery with a shaved head and a lifetime of regrets. You exhale. You've survived the Merovingians. Barely. They weren't just bad rulers, they were chaotic evil, their kingdoms ruled by vendettas, vanity, and wine-soaked conspiracies. But don't relax just yet. The next stop? A king so catastrophically bad, he gets a humiliating nickname that sticks for 1,000 years. You wake to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Cold wind lashes your cheeks. You're in England now, standing on soggy earth sometime around the turn of the first millennium. The sky is grey, and the mood of the kingdom matches it. You don't know it yet, but this fog-slick land is about to be gifted the kind of ruler who makes even the Vikings roll their eyes, Untold the Unready. No, unready doesn't mean he forgot his homework. The name comes from the Old English unread, meaning bad counsel or poorly advised. And oh boy, is that an understatement. He ascends the throne in 978, but not under peaceful circumstances. His older brother, King Edward the Martyr, is assassinated, stabbed to death while visiting their stepmother. The boy King Untold is only around 10 when he takes the throne, and already there's blood on his hands. Whether he was directly involved or just the puppet of power-hungry nobles is still debated, but the stain never washes out. You try to breathe in some royal dignity, but the air here is thick with fear. The Vikings are back, and they are not impressed with the new management. Instead of resisting them with strength or strategy, Untold chooses the medieval equivalent of "please stop." He pays them. Repeatedly. With massive sums of silver known as dangled. At first, it kind of works. The raiders take the money and go away. But then they come back. With friends. Because why sack a town when you can just invoice it? You're in the royal hall now, as Untold paces frantically. His advisors are arguing. Should they build a navy? Fortify the coast? Bribe the Danes again? You glance at Untold and realize he isn't even listening. He's thinking about his next panic decree. Historians still argue whether he was manipulated by scheming courtiers or simply overwhelmed by the times. Then comes 1002, and things get darker. You're standing in the cold shadow of St. Brice's Day, and Untold makes a decision that will echo for centuries. He orders the massacre of all Danes living in England. A preemptive strike, he calls it. What it is, though, is ethnic violence on royal parchment. Among the victims, possibly the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. That's when you realize Untold hasn't just poked the bear. He's slapped it, insulted its mother, and sent it an itemized list of reasons to burn England to the ground. And burn it does. In 1013, Sweyn invades. Untold flees to Normandy with his wife, Emma, and kids, including a boy named Edward, who will one day return as the Confessor. For now, though, you're watching a broken king pacing the beaches of exile, muttering apologies no one can hear. But then Sweyn dies unexpectedly, and Untold gets a second chance. The nobles call him back, but there's a condition: he has to promise to rule better. It's like being rehired on probation, an awkward return for a man who never had the kingdom's confidence to begin with. Back in England, Untold's second reign isn't much better. His army loses again and again. The Vikings, now led by Sweyn's son Nut, are stronger than ever. Untold is tired, paranoid, and isolated. You can feel it in the stone walls of his court. There's no laughter, no loyalty, just the quiet dread of a country waiting to collapse. One quirky footnote in this grey parade: Untold once built a navy of nearly 300 ships, supposedly the largest ever assembled by an English king up to that point. But internal squabbling led to its immediate disbandment. The fleet never sailed. Instead, it rotted in harbour, like a metaphor carved out of wood and disappointment. You reach 1016, and Untold is gone, dead, after nearly 4 decades of flailing rule. His son Edmund Ironside tries to rally England, but the momentum's already lost. Within months, Nut takes the throne, and a Dane now rules England. You wonder if Ethelred even noticed, toward the end, that the kingdom had already slipped from his fingers. 1,000 years later, the name Ethelred the Unready still sticks. It clings to history like an oil stain, soaked in mismanagement, half measures, and the sound of silver being poured into hands that would never be satisfied. And yet, some historians insist we're too hard on him. They say he inherited an impossible situation. That no king could have managed the Viking threat while juggling a volatile nobility, a traumatized childhood, and a crumbling infrastructure. Maybe he was just too early, too human, too afraid. But as you watch England burn from the bluff, one thought keeps recurring. Whatever his reasons, he still paid the Vikings to come back. Repeatedly. You shiver. The cold isn't just from the wind. It's from the realization that medieval kings didn't need to be evil to destroy their kingdoms. Sometimes, sheer incompetence was more than enough. You're ready to move on now, aren't you? But be careful. Your next monarch might look less disastrous at first glance. He has royal bearing, a steady throne, and a fancy title. But don't let the dignity fool you. He's going to mess everything up too, just with a little more style. The wind shifts, and you blink against a sudden blast of gold and ceremony. Welcome to the 9th century. Welcome to the Carolingian Empire. Or rather, what's left of it. Because as you step into the court of Charles the Bald, you're not seeing the height of imperial glory. You're watching the beginnings of a very controlled, very polite, slow-motion train wreck. Yes, that's his real name, Charles the Bald. Though historians still argue whether he was actually bald or if it was just a cruel family nickname. Maybe it meant he lacked land or charisma. Either way, it sticks, and somehow it suits him. He's the kind of man who keeps smiling while the roof quietly burns behind him. Charles was the grandson of Charlemagne, and that's no small shadow to live under. The empire, once vast and terrifying, has already been sliced into family-sized chunks thanks to Frankish inheritance traditions. You're now inside one of those chunks, West Francia. Charles gets this piece in 843 through the Treaty of Verdun, a historical moment that carved up the empire like a poorly made birthday cake. You watch as Charles tries to hold on to what little power he has. But here's the problem. He micromanages like a paranoid landlord. His nobles are constantly testing him, revolting, demanding bribes or concessions. You see him clutching legal documents with trembling fingers, trying to fix things by rewriting titles and oaths. It's bureaucracy with a body count. He spends a lot of time traveling his domain, issuing charters, reaffirming loyalties, doing what looks like work. But there's a frantic edge to it. Like he knows the threads are coming loose, and all he can do is keep stitching faster than they fray. Meanwhile, the Vikings are back in fashion, raiding rivers, sacking cities, burning abbeys. You're with Charles when he watches helplessly as Paris gets looted in 845. That's right, Paris. And what does he do? He pays the invaders to leave. Sound familiar? Yes, it's another Dangerfield moment. Charles shells out thousands of pounds of silver to Ragnar Lodbrok's raiders. But unlike Ethelred, Charles has a better poker face. He spins it as diplomacy. Strategic tribute, he says. But you can see the doubt behind his eyes. You travel with Charles through monastic halls, where he tries to assert royal authority over the church. He calls synods, appoints bishops, tries to outthink rebellious clergy. He wants control, tight, absolute control, but the more he grabs at it, the more it squirms away. He even dabbles in theological debates, aligning himself with the papacy, trying to show he's not just some second-tier monarch in a crumbling realm. And yet, things keep slipping. His brothers feud with him. His sons resent him. The nobles quietly mock him. Even the church, whom he courts so aggressively, often shrugs off his decisions. You begin to realize that Charles is a king in the most exhausting sense, one who must constantly prove he's a king. There's never a moment of rest. Every law, every charter, Every ceremony feels like a performance for an audience that's already halfway out the door. A quirky detail floats into your ears as you follow Charles through a candlelit hall. He may have encouraged the use of Latinized Germanic personal names in royal charters. Why? No one really knows. Maybe to look more Roman, or just to keep his scribes busy. Either way, it gives you a sense of how deep into the paperwork Charles is willing to go to feel in control. By the time you reach 877, Charles is an old man. He sets out to claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a nice gesture, perhaps, but too little, too late. He dies in the Alps on the way back, possibly from dysentery, possibly from stress. Either way, you're left staring at a corpse draped in royal robes, while the mountains echo with silence. After his death, West Francia begins to fragment further. Power slips from kings to nobles. Castles become independent fortresses. France, as we know it, begins to form, not because of Charles's rule, but almost in spite of it. Historians are still divided on him. Some call him a diligent administrator, a stabilizing force in a chaotic age. Others argue he was a paranoid tinkerer who presided over the decline of royal power. One thing's certain, Charles the Bald didn't go down in flames like some kings. He dissolved. Quietly, with 1,000 cautious decisions that added up to failure. You step away from his legacy, your ears ringing with the soft shuffle of crumbling authority. He never launched grand massacres. He didn't massacre his siblings, though that was always on the menu in Frankish families. But he still managed to oversee the slow decay of empire. And now it's time to meet a king whose failures weren't quiet at all. The next ruler on your journey is so infamous that even schoolchildren know his name. Spoiler: it's not for anything good. You're ankle deep in the mud of 13th century England now, and the rain hasn't let up in days. Your boots are soaked, the sky is sulking, and every horse you pass looks as fed up as you feel. But you're not here for the weather. You're here for King John, arguably the most disliked monarch in English history. His reputation is so bad, they didn't even reuse his name. There was never a King John II. That should tell you something. John Plantagenet was the youngest son of Henry II, the baby brother of the famous Richard the Lionheart. You meet him just as he's clawing his way to the throne in 1199. Richard has died of a festering arrow wound, and John, never the obvious choice, is suddenly king. And from the moment he tightens the crown onto his sweaty little head, things go south. Fast. You follow John into the halls of power, and it's clear immediately, he's clever, but not wise. Strategic, but only in the short term. Charming when he needs to be, and cruel when no one's watching. He lacks the honor of his brother, the majesty of his father, or the loyalty of, well, anyone. John's first big disaster comes quickly. He loses Normandy to the French king, Philip II, in 1204. That's not just land, it's the beating heart of the Angevin Empire, the very territories his family built their power on. You can almost hear the nobles gasping. Their holdings, wives, and rents across the channel, gone. All because John couldn't hold the line. Now he's back in England, surrounded by angry barons and snickering enemies. Instead of rebuilding trust, he doubles down on the paranoia. He hikes taxes. He fines landowners for everything. Inheritance. That'll cost you. Marriage approval. That's another fee. Dying without permission. Surprise. Fine. And when barons complain, John seizes hostages. Real ones. Children. You pass a dank tower in Windsor and hear muffled sobbing. That's not a metaphor. That's medieval parenting politics. Then there's the scandal of Arthur of Brittany. John's teenage nephew had a stronger claim to the throne, and was seen by many as a legitimate alternative. In 1203, Arthur is captured. And then, he disappears. Vanishes from the dungeon in ruin. Historians still argue whether John murdered him personally or merely ordered it. Either way, people noticed. You don't just misplace a royal heir without raising eyebrows. The murder, or mystery, if you're feeling diplomatic, drives a wedge between John and his remaining allies. The French use it to paint him as a monster. Back home, whispers spread. People begin calling him John Softsword, which is as insulting as it sounds. Then there's the Pope fiasco. In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury dies. John wants to choose the next one. Pope Innocent III disagrees. They bicker. The Pope chooses Stephen Langton. John refuses to accept him. The Pope retaliates by placing England under an interdict, meaning no church services, no sacraments, no weddings, no burials. It's like turning off the spiritual Wi-Fi. The country starts to panic. John, instead of backing down, confiscates church property and kicks out clergy. He's excommunicated in 1209. Excommunication isn't just spiritual, it's political suicide. It means nobles no longer owe loyalty to you. You're out. You're fair game. Eventually, the pressure mounts. John caves. He agrees to be a vassal of the Pope, even offering England itself as a papal fief. Yes, you watch as the King of England literally hands over his kingdom like it's a security deposit. It's a desperate move, but a savvy one. It gets him back in the Church's good graces and gains him papal protection, just in time for a civil war. Because by 1215, the barons have had it. You're there at Runnymede, probably wetter than you were earlier, when John is forced to sign the Magna Carta. Not a grand, shining moment of liberty, mind you, but more a hostage situation in a field. The barons want protections. Limits on royal power. They want John to stop acting like an unchecked villain in a low-budget drama. The Magna Carta isn't as democratic as schoolbooks claim, but it is a start. A start John immediately ignores. Within months, he's trying to wriggle out of the agreement. War breaks out again, barons rebel, and French forces invade. You walk the smoking ruins of royal castles and smell panic in the court. John is slipping again, clutching at coins and paperwork while his nobles defect en masse. And then, in 1216, something almost poetic happens. John, fleeing rebels across the eastern marshes, loses his crown jewels. Literally. He tries to cross the Wash, a tidal estuary, and misjudges the route. His baggage train, full of gold, silver, relics, and his personal treasure, sinks into the mud. Gone. Never recovered. A few weeks later, John dies of dysentery. It's not a noble death. It's not even a particularly clean one. You're there as he groans in a monastery, racked with pain, dictating final orders no one will follow. He dies alone, unloved, and almost entirely unmourned. And yet, here's the twist. Some medieval chroniclers do attempt to rehabilitate him. A few say he was harsh, yes, but clever. That he laid groundwork for future reforms. But the vast majority, they hate him. Even Shakespeare, writing centuries later, gives him the stink of a man outwitted by fate and haunted by ghosts. He wasn't the worst king in terms of body count, or madness, or tyranny. But he might have been the worst in terms of sheer political ineptitude. A man who alienated allies, lost lands, betrayed promises, and managed to turn every advantage into a liability. You walk away from John's grave at Worcester Cathedral, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. He may not have been cursed, but England certainly felt cursed with him. But don't worry, your next monarch swings hard in the opposite direction. Less incompetence, more vengeance. Less whining, more stabbing. You cross the Pyrenees now, down into the sun-baked kingdom of Castile. The air is sharper here, drier, less forgiving. You can smell leather, steel, and something else beneath it all. Something warm and coppery. Blood. Maybe. Because tonight, you're walking into the throne room of Peter of Castile, a monarch so divisive that even his nickname can't decide whether to flatter or condemn. To his enemies, he's Peter the Cruel. To his defenders, Peter the Just. And as you shuffle past the scorched earth of 14th century Iberia, you start to suspect the truth might be both, or neither. Peter inherits the throne in 1350, during a lull in the Black Death's killing spree. He's just 15. And yes, you're right to feel nervous about another teenage king, especially one raised in a court where murder counts as breakfast entertainment. You first spot Peter pacing in the Alcazar of Seville. His eyes are hard, calculating. His advisors hover at a distance, like they know getting too close might shorten their lifespans. And as you soon learn, they're absolutely right. The early years of Peter's reign are a whirlwind of backstabbing and political crackdowns. At first, he's seen as a reformer, cutting down corrupt nobles and favoring the common people. He taxes the wealthy, promotes capable administrators, and crushes aristocratic rebellion with merciless efficiency. Justice, right? But then the executions start piling up, and the reasons behind them get murky. There's Don Juan of Aragon, poisoned. Juan Alfonso de Albuquerque, his own tutor and former favorite, disposed of in cold blood. The body count keeps ticking upward, and you notice something familiar in Peter's approach. Everyone is either with him, beneath him, or buried. Historians still argue whether Peter's violence was calculated policy or the symptom of a fractured, impulsive mind. Some insist he was battling a corrupt nobility that needed purging. Others say he was a paranoid sadist with a flair for the dramatic. You, meanwhile, are standing behind a tapestry, trying not to breathe too loudly as another noble disappears. Then there's the matter of his personal life. Peter is married, technically, to Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess shipped in for political alliance. But within 3 days of the wedding, he locks her away and never sees her again. Why? Some say she had an affair. Others say Peter was already infatuated with his mistress, Maria de Padilla, and saw Blanche as an obstacle. You sneak a glance at Maria, and she doesn't seem like a villain. She's intelligent, poised, and clearly influential. But Peter's treatment of Blanche isn't romantic neglect, it's cruelty. She's kept in isolation for years before finally being killed, likely on Peter's orders. By now, rebellion is simmering everywhere. Nobles whisper, half-brothers plot. And the most dangerous of them is Henry of Trastamara, Peter's illegitimate sibling, who decides he'd make a better king. The Castilian Civil War breaks out like a wildfire in 1366, and you're thrown into a whirlwind of shifting loyalties and mercenary armies. Peter's own nobility has turned against him, backing Henry. So what does Peter do? He calls in the English. Yes, the English. Specifically the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, who shows up with an army and helps Peter retake the throne after the Battle of Najera in 1367. You're there, dodging arrows and sweat, as Peter's forces triumph. Henry flees. Peter is back. But he doesn't stop with victory. He starts hunting. Anyone who helped Henry. Anyone who hesitated. He purges with renewed fury. You're walking past heads on spikes. The people who once whispered Peter the Just now mutter Peter the Monster. And here's the thing, despite the terror, Peter is still a brilliant administrator. He standardizes currency. He promotes trade. He streamlines taxation. Underneath the corpses, there's actual governance happening. A central authority emerges, and in some regions, the commoners are actually better off. It's maddening, because the lines between justice and cruelty blur into each other. One curious moment, Peter becomes an unlikely protector of the Jews in Castile. While other rulers in Europe are burning synagogues and inventing new ways to blame minorities for plagues, Peter shields Jewish communities from mob violence and offers royal protection. It's a small sliver of light in a reign soaked with shadows. But the rebellion never really dies. In 1369, Henry returns, with French support this time. The tables have turned. You stand at Montiel, where Peter is trapped in a castle, outmaneuvered and outnumbered. There, in a moment both Shakespearean and sickening, Peter is lured into a tent for a parley with Henry. It's a trap. A fight breaks out between the two brothers. Steel flashes. Some say Henry strikes first. Others say Peter fought back, almost won. But in the end, Henry stabs him to death with his own hand. You hear the squelch. You see the crown drop. Peter of Castile is dead. His enemies say good riddance. His defenders call it a murder of justice. The question of what he really was, tyrant or reformer, butcher or stabilizer, remains tangled like a garrote. You wipe the blood from your boots and keep walking. Because if you think this was chaotic, just wait until you meet a king who treats the royal court like a drunken beer festival with bonus executions. You stumble into Bohemia now, through the cobbled streets of 14th century Prague, and something smells off. Not blood this time, at least not yet, but stale beer, spoiled meat, and unwashed royal robes. Because in this section of your journey, you're stepping into the chaotic, intoxicated orbit of Wenceslaus IV, a king who somehow manages to turn royal authority into a kind of prolonged pub brawl. It's around 1378. Charles IV, the brilliant Holy Roman Emperor and one of Europe's most admired rulers, has just died. His son Wenceslaus inherits the thrones of Bohemia and, at least nominally, Germany. You'd expect that royal upbringing, prestige, and political inheritance to create a king who continues his father's legacy. And then, you meet him. His half draped in furs, eyes bleary, goblet in hand. You're pretty sure he's still hungover from a feast 3 nights ago. This is a man born into glory who decided to settle for ale and apathy. Wenceslaus is brilliant on paper, literate, educated, fluent in Latin and Czech. He even commissions manuscripts and builds libraries. But put a crown on him and something short-circuits. He doesn't rule. He lurches. His court becomes a place of random arrests, violent purges, and long pauses between useful decisions. The Bohemian nobility is stunned. They remember his father's golden age. Now they're stuck with a ruler who'd rather guzzle mead in a tavern than attend council meetings. You're in one such tavern now, trying to disappear into the woodwork as Wenceslaus smashes a tankard and challenges a noble to a duel. For what? No one's sure. Maybe a joke that didn't land. Maybe just because it's Thursday. What makes Wenceslaus particularly disastrous isn't just his laziness. It's the erratic, dangerous bursts of energy between long spells of uselessness. You witness him arrest and imprison Jan of Gentane, the Archbishop of Prague, in a fit of rage. That's not just bad form, it's nearly blasphemous. The Pope demands his release. Wenceslaus delays. Defiance turns to scandal. Eventually, the Pope excommunicates him. Yes, again, another king who manages to get booted from the spiritual club. But the crown of Germany is no safer. In 1400, the electors have had enough. They stage a soft coup and elect Rupert of the Palatinate as King of the Romans in Wenceslaus's place. They don't even kill him, just quietly UN king him like returning a broken item for store credit. You're there as the imperial title is taken away. And Wenceslaus? He barely seems to notice. He drinks through the whole thing. Quirky detail time. Wenceslaus had a weird fondness for wolves. Yes, real wolves. He kept them as pets, even inside the palace, and believed they protected him from assassination. That might explain the growling you hear under the banquet table. Meanwhile, Bohemia burns, not literally, but politically. The nobility is fractured, the peasantry restless, and Wenceslaus reacts with paranoid violence. In one notorious case, he personally tortures a group of noblemen he believes have betrayed him. Rumors swirl about branding irons, iron collars, and men who vanish screaming into castle cellars. Still, Wenceslaus has his defenders. Some historians argue he was simply misunderstood, a sensitive soul battling depression, perhaps alcoholism, caught in a time of growing religious and political instability. After all, he did show early support for Jan Hus, the Czech religious reformer whose ideas would later spark a full-scale revolution. That shows some vision, right? But that vision doesn't last. He turns on Hus, too, eventually backing away when the heat rises. Classic Wenceslaus, bold 1 minute, absent the next. By the time you reach 1419, Wenceslaus is barely functioning. The Hussite tensions are peaking. Prague is a tinderbox. Radical preachers are whipping crowds into frenzy, and the nobles are split into Catholic loyalists and fiery reformers. Then it happens. First defenestration of Prague. You're in the town hall as an angry mob storms in, grabs several royal officials, and throws them out the window. No metaphor, they literally defenestrate them, from a great height, onto spears and stones below. News reaches Wenceslaus in his summer palace. And when it does, he dies. Right there. Drops dead from what chroniclers call shock. A stroke, maybe. Or heart failure. Either way, the chaos finally caught up. You stand over his body, thinking not about the king he was, but the king he could have been. With better discipline, less ale, and just a few fewer wolves, maybe he could have stabilized Bohemia. Maybe he could have led reform instead of being flattened by it. But he didn't. He left behind a fractured kingdom on the edge of religious war. His death plunges Bohemia into the Hussite Wars, some of the bloodiest, strangest, most theologically charged conflicts in European history. All because a man who could read Plato decided that beer and revenge made for better statecraft. You step out of Prague's walls, thinking you've seen the worst of royal neglect. But your next king? He's not lazy. He's insane. The bells of Paris toll softly behind you, though they feel less like a chime and more like a funeral dirge. The year is 1392, and France is in the hands of Charles VI, a king whose rule is like standing on a cracked mirror. Every time you think you see something solid, it shatters again. At first glance, things seem fine. Charles is young, handsome, well-educated. They call him Charles the Beloved. You walk beside him during his early years, when he still smiles, still rules, still hopes. His uncles act as regents after the death of his father, Charles V, and though the boy king takes the throne at age 11, he starts to govern in earnest by 21. He replaces his uncles with his loyal advisors, the marmozets, and reforms begin with purpose. But then you feel it. A shift. The air around Charles thickens. His gaze becomes unfocused. His thoughts skip like stones on black water. And in one sudden moment, he snaps. You're with him in the forest of Le Mans. It's 1392, and the king is riding with his knights when a madman darts into the path, screaming that Charles is being betrayed. Already anxious, Charles becomes fixated. Minutes later, he suddenly draws his sword and attacks his own men, killing several before collapsing, unconscious. He wakes days later, confused, exhausted, and changed. From here, the spiral begins. He suffers from episodes of psychosis, vanishing from reality for weeks or months at a time. You watch as he forgets who he is, who his wife is, even that he's a king. He screams. He hides. He believes he's made of glass, a belief so consuming he reportedly wears reinforced clothing and refuses to be touched for fear of shattering. Yes, you heard that right. Charles VI, King of France, thinks he's made of glass. Historians still debate whether Charles suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a rare inherited psychosis. Whatever the cause, one thing's certain: his reign becomes a marionette show. Nobles, relatives, and opportunists take turns yanking the strings, governing in his name while France slowly collapses. And don't forget, this is during the 100 Years' War. England and France are still clawing at each other's throats, and France needs a strong ruler more than ever. Instead, it gets a king who sometimes doesn't recognize his own reflection. You visit his court, and it's a maze of whispering factions. His uncles, most notably the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans, jockey for power. Each wants to be regent, each accuses the other of treason, and the kingdom splinters into camps. At court feasts, tension thickens like spoiled wine. And then comes the Bal des Ardents in 1393, an event so bizarre you wonder if France itself is having a mental breakdown. It's a masquerade ball, a wedding celebration. Charles and 5 other nobles dress as wild men, in costumes of flax and pitch, meant to look like hairy beasts. They dance. They howl. Then someone brings in a torch. What follows is a mass immolation. The costumes ignite instantly. Flames leap. Guests scream. 4 of the dancers are burned alive in front of the royal court. Charles survives only because a quick-thinking duchess throws her skirts over him. You stare into the fire, unsure what horrifies you more, the spectacle itself, or the fact that this is somehow not the lowest point of his reign. As the king's episodes worsen, France divides. The Armagnacs back the king's brother, Louis of Orleans. The Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, take the other side. Paris becomes a war zone. You dodge between armored street patrols and mobs with pitchforks. It's civil war, but no one calls it that, not yet. One of the kingdom's most infamous moments comes in 1407, when John the Fearless has Louis murdered in the street. No subtlety, no deniability, just a brutal assassination with political undertones and permanent consequences. From then on, France isn't just fighting the English. It's fighting itself. And all the while, Charles VI fades further. Sometimes he can string together a meeting. Other times, he's missing for weeks, silent, vacant, trembling. You see him sitting alone in a great hall, surrounded by servants who pretend not to notice that the king is humming to his own glass reflection in a goblet. Quirky fact. During some lucid periods, Charles insists on playing cards and dancing, even if there's famine outside the gates. His court indulges him, anything to keep the illusion alive. France may be burning, but at least the king is smiling, today. Then comes 1415. The Battle of Agincourt. You're there, in the French camp, watching as the nobles fumble their way into catastrophe. Charles isn't leading the army, he can't. Instead, the French elite ride headlong into one of the most humiliating defeats in their history. Longbows slice through their armor. Mud traps their horses. English forces, vastly outnumbered, cut them down like wheat. The loss is so severe, it shakes the kingdom. Morale, nobility, royal legitimacy, it all takes a hit. And while Charles stares at a mirror, England takes more ground. Then, in 1420, the final insult, the Treaty of Troyes. Charles, pressured by his queen and the Burgundians, signs away France's future. He disinherits his own son, the Dauphin, and names Henry V of England as heir to the throne of France. It's unprecedented, unthinkable, and it seals France's fate, at least temporarily, as a fractured, humiliated kingdom. Charles dies in 1422. France is technically ruled by an English child, Henry VI. The real heir, Charles VII, has been pushed aside. The only reason he'll rise again? A peasant girl from Domremy, but that's another story entirely. For now, you step away from the echoing halls of a reign defined by madness. Charles the Beloved becomes Charles the Mad in every whispered retelling. And while his illness earns some sympathy, his reign leaves the kingdom gutted, humiliated, and splintered. You pause, thinking you've reached peak dysfunction. But the next king, he doesn't suffer from madness. He simply chooses chaos. And on his royal menu, cannibalism. Allegedly. You step lightly now, carefully, as if the walls themselves have ears. Because they do. You're in 15th century Wallachia, and the scent in the air isn't wine or wood smoke, but something metallic and nauseating. Blood. Rot. Fear. This is the realm of Vlad III Dracula, known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. To his subjects, he is both sword and shadow. To his enemies, he is nightmare incarnate. The forests whisper his name. Villagers bow to empty roads, just in case he's watching. You pause outside Targovite, Wallachia's capital, and your feet hesitate. You already know this is going to be different. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad is no ordinary monarch. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric league meant to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. The name Dracula simply means son of the dragon. You'd think that sounds heroic. You'd be wrong. Vlad's early years are a volatile cocktail of trauma. He and his brother Rodu are sent as hostages to the Ottoman court. Historians still argue whether this was diplomacy or glorified blackmail. Either way, the Ottomans teach Vlad politics, discipline, and brutality. He watches punishments, learns the mechanics of fear. He also watches as Radu becomes friendly with the Turks. Too friendly, perhaps. When Vlad returns to Wallachia in 1448, he's bitter, hardened, and determined to rule. And he will, but not just as a king. As an instrument of terror. His reign begins with insecurity. His claim to the throne is challenged by rival families, Hungarian forces, and, of course, the Ottomans. So what does Vlad do? He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't bribe. He eliminates. In one infamous moment, he invites hundreds of boyars, nobles who plotted against him or his father, to a grand banquet. They feast, drink, laugh, and then Vlad has them impaled or forced into hard labor building a fortress. You stand at the edge of that hall, sickened by the smoke and screaming. It's not justice. It's a message. Impaling, of course, is Vlad's signature. A long, sharpened stake inserted. Well, you know where. The victim is hoisted upright, and death takes hours. Sometimes days. Vlad has entire forests of impaled corpses erected outside cities, grim warnings to invaders and rebels alike. The stench carries for miles. One quirky tale: when Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans before him, citing religious custom, Vlad calmly nailed the turbans to their skulls, ensuring they'd never take them off again. You're realizing now, he's not chaotic in the way drunken kings are. This is intentional, calculated horror. He rules by terror the way a blacksmith rules by hammer. But is he evil? Here's where it gets twisted. Crime in Wallachia drops to nearly zero. Peasants leave coins in the street unmolested. Merchants travel in safety. His cruelty, while legendary, is also effective. Some argue he was simply a man shaped by savage times, a patriot using extreme tools to defend a fragile border state. Still, it's hard to justify what you see in 1462. The Ottomans invade. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh off his conquest of Constantinople, marches into Wallachia with an army nearly 100,000 strong. Vlad can't outfight him, so he out-terrors him. He burns his own villages, poisons wells, and unleashes plague victims into Ottoman camps. But the true horror? As the Sultan approaches Targovite, he's met by the forest of the impaled, some 20,000 corpses lining the road. The Sultan halts. He stares. And then he retreats. You look at Vlad, perched on a ruined wall, smiling faintly. To him, that's victory. But not everyone agrees. By the late 1460s, Vlad is exiled. His alliances crumble. He's imprisoned by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, possibly due to diplomatic pressure from the Ottomans or to accusations of, believe it or not, excessive cruelty. Even in an era of executions and flaying, he is considered too much. There's even a claim, though highly disputed, that Vlad was fond of dining among the impaled, dipping bread in their blood. A fringe story, yes, but the fact that people believed it speaks volumes about his legacy. Eventually, Vlad returns to power in 1476. Briefly, the details of his final days are murky. He's ambushed, either by Turks, or Wallachian rivals, or both. His head is sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, preserved in honey. And yet, centuries later, his legend grows. He becomes Bram Stoker's Dracula, though the vampire barely resembles the historical figure. Still, the association sticks. Tourists wander Transylvania looking for coffins. Scholars write entire volumes debating whether he was a sadist or a nationalist, a psychopath or a misunderstood hero. Even Romanians remain split. Some honor him as a defender of Christendom. Others flinch at his name. You leave Wallachia shaken. You've seen kings who were foolish, weak, and delusional. But Vlad? He was none of those things. He was deliberately terrifying. And your next king? He won't impale you. No, He'll politely ruin your life through ceaseless paranoia, random violence, and a courtroom that never, ever sleeps. Welcome to Russia. The frost clings to your eyebrows before you've even taken 10 steps. Russia does not welcome visitors softly, especially not in the 16th century. The snow crunches like bones beneath your boots, and the wind feels personal. You're in the heart of Muscovy now, and from the distant black towers of the Kremlin, you feel the pulse of a monarch whose shadow reaches across every inch of the land. Ivan IV Vasilevich, or as you already know him, Ivan the Terrible. The first Tsar of all the Russias. The first to crown himself with imperial authority. And the first in this story to truly earn the title of worst in a way that is terrifyingly multifaceted. He is not mad in the way Charles VI was, nor cruel in the gleeful way of Vlad. Ivan is cold, deliberate, burned by betrayal, and fueled by paranoia. The sort of king who smiles while cutting a throat, convinced he's preserving the soul of the nation. Born in 1530, Ivan becomes Grand Prince at just 3 years old after his father's death. You walk through the freezing corridors of his childhood, surrounded by scheming boyars, noble families vying for control while the child watches, silent and unblinking. His mother is poisoned when he's 8. After that, Ivan's eyes grow darker, more calculating. Historians still argue whether this childhood trauma explains what comes next, or just makes it harder to look away. By 1547, Ivan crowns himself Tsar, not merely prince, but Caesar, with divine authority. It's more than a title, it's a statement. Russia answers to no one but God, and me. His early rule surprises you. He reforms the legal code, streamlines taxation, even calls for a kind of proto-parliament, the Zemsky Soba. He builds St. Basil's Cathedral, and you pause outside it, stunned by its bright, dreamlike domes piercing the grey winter sky. For a moment, you think maybe this won't be so bad. Then Anastasia dies. His beloved wife. Probably poisoned, like his mother. And something breaks in Ivan. You hear the crack behind his eyes. Grief curdles into rage. Rage hardens into obsession. He begins to believe that the nobility, the boyars, are conspiring against him. And maybe some are. But Ivan doesn't investigate. He destroys. Enter the Oprichnina. This is not a policy. It's a reign of terror wrapped in black velvet and forged in nightmare. Ivan splits Russia into 2 halves, one ruled normally, the other directly controlled by him and his handpicked enforcers, the Oprichniki. They ride black horses, dress in black robes, and display severed dog heads on their saddles to symbolize their loyalty, sniffing out treason and biting into it. You see them ride through Novgorod, where, in 1570, Ivan accuses the city of treason. Over the course of 5 weeks, thousands are tortured, drowned, flayed, or impaled. Entire families wiped out. The clergy are not spared. Children are thrown into icy rivers. And Ivan? He watches. Sometimes he leads the executions personally. One chronicler says he enjoyed watching people be boiled alive. Another tells of prisoners sewn into bare skins and torn apart by dogs. Some of these may be exaggerated, but the truth is already so appalling, it hardly matters. A quirky but disturbing detail? Ivan was obsessed with alchemy and prophecy. He kept astrologers close, commissioned bizarre mechanical contraptions, and believed divine visions were guiding his punishments. He even wrote impassioned theological letters to church leaders, justifying mass murder as a form of spiritual purification. And then there's the most infamous moment. It's 1581. You're in the palace, holding your breath, as Ivan, already deteriorating, trembling, furious, gets into an argument with his pregnant daughter-in-law. He accuses her of indecency. When his son, Ivan Ivanovich, defends her, the Tsar strikes him. Not with words. With his iron-tipped staff. He kills his own heir. The crown prince dies slowly, bleeding out in his father's arms. The Tsar sobs, wails, reportedly cries out that he has killed his son. It's the first human emotion you've seen from him in a decade. But it's too late. Russia now has no strong heir. The dynasty will die with his weaker son, Fedor. The country will plunge into a time of troubles, an era of famine, war, and imposter tsars so destabilizing it nearly ends the Russian state. Even in death, Ivan casts a long shadow. He dies in 1584, slumped during a chess game, likely from a stroke. The room is quiet, cold. His body is buried beside Anastasia, though his legacy remains anything but peaceful. Some historians argue Ivan was simply a strong leader in a brutal age. That his ruthlessness forged a centralized Russian state. That without him, Russia would have fractured completely. Others say he destroyed the very soul of his country, replacing community with fear, leadership with psychosis, and loyalty with terror. You walk away from his grave slowly. The snow picks up again. You think of St. Basil's Cathedral, still standing, still beautiful, and wonder if it's a memorial to his genius, or his madness. But before you can process it, the wind changes again. Your next king doesn't burn cities or torture nobles. No, he just loses everything. Empire, power, dignity, all evaporated, because he refused to adapt. Your next step takes you to the Ottoman Empire, to a man born with destiny in his hands, and cluelessness in his heart. You arrive beneath the blazing sun of 17th century Constantinople, a city straddling two worlds, Europe and Asia, tradition and change, glory and decay. The air is thick with spices, smoke, and the calls of merchants. But you're here to meet a sultan whose reign is remembered less for conquest and more for confusion, catastrophe, and chaos. Sultan Ibrahim I, also known as Ibrahim the Mad. You find him in the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and courtiers tiptoeing around his whims. The man who ascended the throne in 1640 is, by all accounts, a deeply troubled soul. At first, he seemed promising. Ibrahim was educated, fluent in several languages, and reportedly kind in his youth. But as the years wear on, his mental health deteriorates sharply. His behavior swings wildly, from moments of sweetness to terrifying fits of rage. One day, he might order lavish celebrations and feast for weeks. The next, he demands that the city be painted gold. He once commanded that 40,000 jars of honey be consumed, simply because he felt like it. When he suspected his own mother of plotting against him, he imprisoned her indefinitely. You watch as paranoia consumes him. He becomes convinced that plots surround him on every side. He orders executions of his own viziers and generals, sometimes dozens in a single day. His palace becomes a place of fear, where no one dares speak without trembling. Historians still argue whether Ibrahim suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe trauma from childhood neglect and imprisonment. Whatever the diagnosis, the impact on the empire is undeniable. The Ottoman military falters. Administration grinds to a halt. Corruption explodes. Foreign enemies sense weakness and press harder. The once mighty empire begins to unravel. One of the strangest anecdotes you overhear involves Ibrahim's obsession with animals, especially his pet elephant, which he reportedly dressed in royal robes and forced to attend court ceremonies. It's unclear if this was a whimsical act or a symptom of his detachment from reality. Eventually, the Janissaries, the elite military corps, lose patience. In 1648, they storm the palace and force Ibrahim's abdication. He's imprisoned in a small, windowless chamber where he dies 2 years later, reportedly forgotten and broken. As you leave Constantinople, the streets buzz with whispers of lost grandeur and wasted potential. Ibrahim's reign is a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and untreated mental illness can erode even the greatest of empires. You take a deep breath of the salty Bosphorus air and prepare yourself. Your next king is coming, and he's a different kind of disaster. One who will burn his own kingdom to the ground, literally. You find yourself amid the smoky haze and cracked cobblestones of late 17th century France, where the Sun King's legacy casts a long, gilded shadow. But your attention is fixed on his great-grandson, Louis XVI, a man whose story is more tragedy than triumph. It's 1774. Louis ascends the throne amid the echoes of Versailles grandeur and the whispers of a nation simmering beneath. You walk through the palace corridors where opulence hides desperation. France is wealthy, powerful, yet deeply unequal. The peasants toil while nobles feast. Louis XVI is a man of contradictions. You see him as shy and indecisive, well-meaning but overwhelmed by the weight of monarchy. He tries reform, he really does. But his heart isn't in the ruthless politics needed to save the crown. His attempts at fiscal reform are strangled by noble resistance and his own hesitation. You watch him falter under the gaze of his queen, Marie Antoinette, whose own reputation is a tangle of gossip and scandal. They seem distant, disconnected from the swelling unrest. Quirky detail: Louis XVI was an avid locksmith and tinkerer, often found fiddling with clocks and gadgets rather than governing. It's almost endearing, if not so tragic. By the 1780s, France's financial crisis spirals. Debt mounts. Bread prices skyrocket. The common people grow restless. You stand among protesters in Paris, chanting and throwing stones. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 shocks the monarchy. Louis XVI's world crumbles. He's forced to accept a constitutional monarchy but still dreams of regaining absolute power. His secret attempts to flee the country, the flight to Varennes, betray his desperation and disconnect. The revolution escalates. You see the guillotine's shadow grow. Louis is arrested, tried, and in 1793, executed by beheading. The ancient regime collapses with his fall. Historians still debate whether Louis was a hopelessly weak king doomed by circumstances, or a tragic figure trapped by his own indecision and a rapidly changing world. As the blade falls, you feel the weight of centuries of monarchy ending, not with a bang, but a slicing whisper. You step back from the scaffold and steel yourself. Your next monarch is a wild card from a distant land, one who will rule with theatrical cruelty, mysterious madness, and a flair that borders on absurdity. Prepare for the tale of Emperor Nero. But no, wait, that's Roman. This one is more 18th century, more Asian, and somehow even more unpredictable. You've crossed the Channel and now stand on the foggy shores of 11th century England, where a king named Ethelred the Unready reigns, a monarch so infamous that his nickname barely scratches the surface of his reign's chaos. Unready doesn't mean he was unprepared. It comes from the Old English unread, meaning poor counsel or ill-advised. And believe me, the man's advice was disastrous. Ethelred inherits the throne in 978, a time when England faces constant Viking raids. You're with him as the seas darken with dragon-headed longships, and coastal villages burn. But instead of mounting effective resistance, Ethelred tries a strategy that will echo through history, paying off the Vikings with Danegeld, a kind of ancient protection racket. Year after year, England sends tons of silver across the North Sea, hoping the Vikings will go away. Spoiler, they don't. They come back, angrier and bigger, demanding more. At court, you watch Ethelred hesitate, trust advisors who betray him, and make decisions that confuse even his closest allies. His reign is marked by paranoia and purges, including the notorious St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when he orders the killing of Danes living in England. It backfires horribly, inflaming Viking fury. The most infamous Viking, Sweyn Forkbeard, invades with a vengeance. Ethelred is forced to flee to Normandy, and for a few years, England is ruled by the Vikings themselves. Historians still argue whether Ethelred's failures were due to personal incompetence or impossible circumstances. Either way, you're left shaking your head at a king who could neither lead nor negotiate peace. As you leave the smouldering ruins of his reign behind, you wonder how England will ever recover from this relentless cycle of fear and misrule. Your next king will try, but fail spectacularly, to unify a broken kingdom under a new, brutal dynasty. You stand now at the crossroads of England and Scotland in the early 12th century, gazing up at a crown worn by a man whose ambition burns hotter than his ability to hold it, King Stephen of England. It's 1135, and the peaceful transition of power has just been shattered by the death of Henry I's only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the tragic White Ship disaster. Without a clear heir, Stephen, Henry's nephew, seizes the crown in a swift, unorthodox coup. You can almost hear the whispering nobles questioning his claim as he mounts the throne. Stephen's reign quickly devolves into what chroniclers call the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war that fractures England like a dropped stained glass window. You're swept into a landscape littered with burned villages, rival barons fighting tooth and nail, and a king who struggles to command loyalty. His rule is marked by indecision and military incompetence. You watch as castles spring up like weeds, held by unruly nobles who act more like warlords than subjects. Stephen is unable to enforce royal authority, and his court resembles a patchwork of feuding factions more than a seat of power. Quirky detail: Stephen was known for his fondness for hunting, sometimes abandoning critical battles to pursue game. It's both tragic and oddly human, the king distracted by deer while his kingdom slips away. Historians still argue whether Stephen was genuinely weak or simply overwhelmed by circumstances beyond any one man's control. But the chaos is undeniable. The phrase "a land without a king" seems apt. The war finally ends in 1153 with the Treaty of Wallingford, where Stephen agrees to recognize Henry Plantagenet, future Henry II, as his heir. Stephen dies a year later, a broken man who spent his reign chasing shadows and losing ground. You leave England's torn fields behind, carrying the sense that sometimes a king's worst crime is simply being unable to hold the kingdom together when it matters most. Your journey takes you now to a colder, darker throne, the icy lands of medieval Scotland, and a king known less for deeds than for his name, King John Balliol, the pawn of stronger powers and the architect of his own undoing. You find yourself on the rugged, windswept hills of late 13th century Scotland, where the air tastes of peat smoke and bitter rivalry. The throne is claimed by a man named John Balliol, a king whose very reign feels like a tragic footnote in the struggle between Scotland's fierce independence and England's encroaching power. John's ascent is hardly triumphant. Following the death of the Scottish King Alexander III and then his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, Scotland is left without a clear heir. You're there as the great cause unfolds, a legal contest where multiple claimants vie for the crown, but ultimately Edward I of England picks John Balliol as the new king in 1292. It's a decision that dooms John before he even sits on the throne. From the start, Edward treats John like a puppet, demanding fealty and using him to further English interests. The Scots chafe under this, but John lacks the strength and will to resist. You observe John trying to assert independence, attempting to convene his own parliament, rally the nobles, and govern. But each step forward is met with an English shove backward. Quirky fact: John's reign includes a brief foray into coinage reform, where he introduced new silver pennies that some say were lighter and less valuable. Perhaps a subtle reflection of his weakened authority. Eventually, tensions boil over. In 1296, Edward invades, defeats John, and deposes him. John is humiliated, forced into exile in France, and mocked as the tomb tabard, the empty coat, a king who wore the crown but had no real power. Historians still debate whether John was simply outmatched by political giants or a fundamentally weak ruler who failed to rise to the moment. As you watch the Scots rise in rebellion under William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, you realize John's failure is not just personal but symbolic, the frailty of a nation caught between empire and freedom. You leave the misty glens behind, knowing the last king you'll meet is the ultimate paradox, a ruler whose reign brought destruction and renewal, tyranny and reform, a man so feared he became legendary, and so powerful he reshaped the world. Your final stop is the court of King Richard III, or rather, the shadow he casts over history. You walk through the cold, grey streets of 15th century England, the air thick with fog and suspicion. It's 1483, and the throne is held by a man whose name still echoes through history with controversy and myth, Richard III. You've arrived at the climax of your journey, a king whose story is a tapestry of betrayal, ambition, and mystery. Richard's path to power is a twisted one. Born a prince of the House of York, he's a skilled warrior and politician. But when his brother, King Edward IV, dies unexpectedly, Richard is named protector of the young heirs. Almost immediately, whispers spread that he is not content to guard the throne but to seize it. You witness the infamous disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Edward IV's two young sons, who vanish under Richard's watch. Their fate remains one of England's darkest mysteries. Did Richard order their murder? Historians still argue, with no definitive proof either way. Richard is crowned king, but his reign is short and turbulent. You see the kingdom divided, nobles plotting, alliances shifting like shadows. Despite his efforts to govern wisely, he passes laws to protect the poor and reform the legal system. The stain of suspicion clings to him. His physical appearance feeds the legend: hunchbacked, with a withered arm, a man almost villainous in form. Shakespeare immortalizes him as a scheming monster, but recent discoveries, like his skeleton unearthed in 2012, suggest a more complex figure. You find yourself torn between the stories. Was Richard a ruthless tyrant, or a scapegoat for a desperate political crisis? A capable leader undone by propaganda and fate? His end comes at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where Henry Tudor defeats him, ending the Wars of the Roses and beginning the Tudor dynasty. You watch the battlefield in slow motion as Richard fights fiercely, falling in the dust, the last king to die in battle on English soil. As you stand over his grave, long lost beneath a car park until recently rediscovered, you feel the weight of history's judgment, the tragic fall of a king whose story is still being rewritten. And with that, your journey through the worst kings in medieval history begins to ease. You exhale slowly, letting the echoes of these fractured thrones and broken crowns fade into the background. The clamor of castles and courts, the bitter taste of betrayal, the heavy silence of madness and despair, all begin to soften, like distant thunder rolling away. These kings, flawed and fallible, remind us that power is no shield against human frailty. Some ruled with cruelty, some with weakness, others with madness. Yet each left a mark, a shadow lingering in history's halls. Now, as you settle deeper into your chair, the past grows quiet. The restless ghosts of kings long gone find their rest, their stories whispered to the wind. Remember, history is never just about kings and crowns. It's about us, watching, learning, and sometimes, simply surviving the tales we inherit. So dim the lights a little more, breathe in the stillness, and drift gently toward your own story, wherever it may lead. Sweet dreams.